Greetings! In this video I'll be painting an Infernus Marine Sergeant from the Blood Angels chapter. This model is a standard Infernus Marine, but I've used some upgrades from the old Primaris upgrades kit, and a tilt shield that I had in my bits box. This is the primary reference that I'll be using from the 8th edition codex. I'll be using bits cropped from here and some other random references throughout the video. I've been wanting to try the Blood Angels scheme for a while now, and was curious if I could get the blue helmet, typical of fire support squads in the Blood Angels, to look nice with the red armour. Like usual, I've prom molded black, so it's simple for you guys to replicate if you want. Now onto the painting itself, starting with an all-over base coat with Mephiston red. I did a few thin passes to keep a smooth finish, but was otherwise fairly messy with the application. The other bits will be painted over later. Now for some Black Legion to clean up the undersuit details and block in the weapon casing, pauldron faces, the Imperialis on the torso, one of the knee pads, and I also painted half the tilt shield, which I'll put decals on later. At this point I wanted to get some decals on there, deciding that I wanted to go fairly heavy with the decals. I used some gloss varnish to prepare all the surfaces that you can see on screen, though I did decide against doing one on the Pyreblaster. I wasn't sure which decals to use, especially for the squad markings, there's so many to pick from, and most would be quite annoying to do with freehand, so I went with the Sergeant from the 9th Squad of the 2nd Company. I also put a selection of decals on the tilt shield, a chapter armorial on the back of the power pack, and a Carcharis campaign badge on the left greave. Now onto that blue helmet, signifying a fire support squad. I used Macragge blue as a base coat here, thinning it with a bit of water and applying 2 coats. Onto a bunch of random details around the model now, starting with Rhinox hide to block in the leather details, like the holster and the belt. Next I used some Zandri dust to base coat the purity seal parchment, followed by Screamer Pink for the wax. Moving back to the leather, I used some Scrag Brown to do an edge highlight, and build up some texture on the holster by doing a bunch of lines along an area that has a slight rise on it, which I used as a rough guide. I did a few coats to yield a smoother result. Going back to the paper, I used some Ushabti bone as the first highlight, applying it over the upwards facing surfaces and along some edges. I then used some Deathclaw brown to do the finishing touches on the leather. This was mostly the same as the previous step here, just doing it in a smaller area and picking out some specific spots that I wanted to highlight. Now moving back to the purity seal to finish it off, using Screaming Skull along the edges and sharpest paths of the raised surfaces and Pink Horror as a standard edge highlight for the wax. I switched back to Black Legion to paint some scribbles on the purity seal, which finishes these little details for now. Now for the wrist lights and eye lenses. I went with Warpstone Glow as the base coat, applying it in 2 coats over the wrist lights and eye lenses. I followed that with Moot Green, doing smaller areas on each surface, avoiding the recesses and generally aiming for a specific spot, like the middle of the helmet or one corner of the wrist lights. Dorn Yellow finishes this part off, by doing a smaller area still. As I planned to do a few colours to highlight the red armour, I decided I wanted to try the same with the blue. I used some Altdorf Guard Blue to layer up the raised surfaces of the helmet, basically anywhere that isn't too hidden away or otherwise in a recess. To finish the highlights for the blue, I used some Calgar Blue, applied along the edges with some scratches for good measure. I also used this to clean up anywhere where I had gone over with the green eye lenses. Now onto the metallics, starting with Gunmetal Grey. This was applied over the power pack details, the Pyre Blaster chassis and shroud, armour and helmet details, and the other various bits around the model, like the fuel canister and the pistol grip in the holster. If I wasn't using the metal colour range for the metals, I'd be using Iron Warriors from Citadel. It's a fairly similar colour, I just prefer the flow properties from the metal colour range. On to highlighting the metal now, using Duraluminium. I like using this over the edges and any upwards facing surfaces to force a strong shine. The heat shroud on the Pyre Blaster received a full pass of this, as I plan to tint it later using contrast paints, and a brighter base coat would work in my favour there. Now for some gold details, using Retributor armour. I painted the skulls and teardrop gem casings with this colour. It'd be nice if the metal colour range had a gold like this. The gold in their range is a lot colder and a little too green for my liking. I briefly used some Eshin grey to paint in some highlights for the weapon casing and the Imperialis on the torso, though I kinda tuned out while recording so I didn't get very good footage. Now it's time to finally highlight the armour, using some Evil Sunz Scarlet. I thinned this a bit and applied some passes over the armour sections that I felt needed emphasising in brightness. Most sections were hit with this, and I did some edge highlights for parts that weren't hit. I wanted this to be both an increase in brightness in the areas in natural light, but also to increase how vivid the red was overall. The Blood Angels used some of the strongest reds of all the Astartes chapters, and I wanted to reflect that here. I also used this for the gemstones, applying some thin coats around one side of the drop to try for some fake transparency or depth. I went back in with Black Legion, thinned it a little bit, to apply some black back over the other side, trying to keep a nice gradient between the red and the black. Now back to the armour, using Trollslayer Orange as the final edge highlight. I was initially only going to use this over the very sharp corner bits, but after starting to apply it, it was a lot less noticeable than I thought it'd be. So I was fairly generous with the application, especially as I knew I was going to do an enamel wash towards the end, which would darken it down. Now for some chipping effects on the armour, using some Storm Vermin fur. I painted a few scratches over the previous colours, as well as dotting along some of the edges. It's not a very strong effect, but I think it works well in this case. Alright, now for the heat effect on the Pyre Blaster. I used Talassar Blue, Magos Purple, and Aggaros Dunes, applied wet so I could mix them on the model itself. The brush wasn't damp enough for the blue, but the others worked out well. These worked to make a heat gradient, though I applied the Aggaros Dunes over the fuel canisters as well, as I like how it looks and helps differentiate them from the rest of the metal. I think it's in need of some scorching, the effect's a bit stark as it is. I used some Black Legion applied with a dry brush technique over the shroud, focusing towards the front. On the camera this appears to hide the blue completely at first glance, but you can see it from certain angles. It does look really cool in person. Lastly, I applied some black enamel Paneliner over most of the model. I focused this in the recesses, but I also went over some of the larger panels, because as it dries it kind of separates a little bit, leaving a grimy finish. I did make sure to cover each of the holes in the Pyre Blaster heat shroud, as I wanted them to be almost entirely black, and this works fine for that. It also helped around the gems, giving a cleaner finish between the red of the gems and the black shadowy recess. After about an hour or two for it to dry enough, I applied my usual basing method, painted the base rim black, and sealed everything in with some ultramatte varnish. And here we have it, an Infernus Marine Sergeant of 9th Squad, 2nd Company, the Blood Angels chapter. This model was a lot of fun, but it felt like a daunting task as I started working on it. There was a lot of details here, but most of that was just switching paints to do tiny bits that only take a few seconds. Still, I think it was all worth it. It did come out a bit darker than I wanted, but I think a lot of that's due to the very dark panel lines. I was considering going for a brown wash instead, as that would align with the more warm red that I was going for, but I wanted to see if the orange highlights could make up the difference. I'll let you guys decide if it worked. Otherwise, there's the Red Wolves video I did recently, which had a different approach that might suit this chapter better. I just want to try out a bunch of different methods, giving myself and you guys some workshopping of different recipes to see what works for whatever we're going for. As for the rest of the model, I think the heat effect came out nice, and the decals work fairly well to add interest. though I am a bit disappointed about the yellow decals, which have a bit of transparency at the edge. This makes it look like there's a little green edge around the decals, kind of like when you apply a thin yellow coat over black or blue. The decals are fairly small and still better than what I could do by hand, so I think the trade-off is alright. Just something to note. The blue helmet was always a sticking point for me. Blue and red rarely work well together unless one is less saturated than the other. Like a pale blue can work with a rich red, but if they were both rich, they'd just be fighting each other, like old school dazzle camouflage. I think the blue recipe that I used, the same for my Ultramarines, worked well in this case. It's a fairly muted blue and the colours even have a little bit of red pigment in them. You can see that on the pots if you haven't used them a while, as the paint separates. Had I used stronger blues like Calgar Sky or Techless Blue, I think the contrast between the blue and the red would just be too jarring. But anyway, let me know what you guys think in the comments, if you have any suggestions for chapters and whatnot. Otherwise, that's all I've got for this one. Hope you stick around for the next one.